Good evening, everyone. This is Dr. Calev Lehrer, Apostolic Messianic International, with a morning prayer journey where we talk about devotional issues of the Siddur and we discuss Messianic faith. Now, today we want to talk about the Yirat Adonai. Now, how many people have a spiritual chicken list? Have you ever had those places where you felt like God was directing you to do something and immediately fear begins to raise up, the thoughts come, our mind begins to reason us away from God's direction, and in the end, we really end up doing nothing. We've all had this thing where we've really missed it at some point, and we've had to come to the place really where we had to make a conscious decision to get out of this fear merry-go-round and exercise our faith. Faith was meant to be something active. It's never something passive. Sometimes God comes in and He'll use our troubles to give us an occasion to cleave to Him, to cleave to a promise, to believe in who and what He is. And when trouble comes in, it can affect us. It can affect our security. It can affect us emotionally. And fear, a lot of times, is the natural response. Our fears, our personal needs, our life lessons all teach us how to lend a type of honor or some type of weight to the things that life throws our way. It gives us a degree of importance and respect for a lot of things. Now, often we weigh the likelihood of success or the aversion of suffering on either side of the scale of life. And sometimes we can hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and we try to walk before God and rationalize His will, holding faith in one hand and then holding fear in the other. And while fear is a human quality and a natural response to some things, we need to distinguish a good fear from a bad one, and there are both. A good fear helps us to give honor or weight to the word and the person of God. A bad fear is a judgment that comes whenever we realize that things are really out of our control and that we may be violated by life. Now, in bad faith, the sister of bad faith is always despair, and it's always close at hand. Whenever we judge our crises in the light of our personal capacity, we always see that we're never quite enough, and fear can be just inevitable. The faith, by definition, assumes that we are not enough and that we need God's help. And in the end, if we're not careful, we start to make decisions of life out of fear, inadequacy, or our assumption of imminent failure. What type of fear we have will drive us and sometimes determine the extent that we can really step forward and believe in God. Now, I'm convinced that God leads us into places where we have to sacrifice our fears, our insecurities, our limitations on the altar of faith. In this sense, faith and fear are two options in crisis that will either unite us with God or will keep us away from His will. Faith is an invitation. When we choose to look to God, He spreads His provision and His opportunity before us, and He invites us in because we are His children, Psalms 91 and 4. But how do we manage the fear that's so intangible in crisis? It's so real. It grips us sometimes by the throat. The Yirat Adonai prayer is based off of Psalms 111 and 10, and it anchors us in a reverential awe of God. And it goes like this. It says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all they that do His commandments. His praise endures forever. Blessed be the name of His glorious kingdom forever and ever." Now, the fear that is mentioned here is not a reference to what ultimately terrifies us. It's a relational reference to what we stand in awe of and respect. It includes actual fear, but also includes things like love, honor, reverence, Psalms 33 and 8. The fear of the Lord has been called the fountain of life, Proverbs 14 and 27. Another reference states that the fear of the Lord leads to life, and whoever has it rests satisfied. He will not be visited by harm, Proverbs 19 and 23. It's a part of being the friend of God in Psalms 25 and 14, having strong confidence, Proverbs 14 and 26. The provision of God in Psalms 37 and 4, security in Psalms 27 and 1, riches and honor and life in Proverbs 22 and 4, and being blessed in Psalms 128, 1 through 4. It's fear that accepts the limitations of life and the spiritual invitation for every God given promise and sees the majesty of God who wants to come and intervene and heal and raise up a testimony of his greatness and his goodness. Now, the Modi Ani prayer is about giving God thanks for his covenant faithfulness and committing to walk out our waking moments ultimately through the whole day and give them to God's purpose. The Yirat Adonai prayer reminds us that we belong to God and that we are his children. It centers our attention on the fact that God is greater and his word is greater than our calamity. It's our obedience to his word and the cleaving to his promise that puts our problems really in perspective. The problems are a means to introduce the grace of God into our life and the lives of others. It's not an end. It's during our crisis and our challenges that our faith is always trained to not succumb to fear. Part of our reverence to God is to cleave to his promise and faithfulness despite what we fear or even ultimately what we feel. This gives us some type of spiritual courage, and faith will usually involve taking these kinds of risks. It's risk to self esteem, it's risk to self confidence, it's the risk of being wrong, the risk of being humiliated. True faith always seems to violate our humanity in these ways, and it forces us to live life looking in a different direction than most people. And traveling spiritually and materially in the realm of the unknown, like we do sometimes in our faith, we don't know sometimes how things will work out or whether or not they even will. Sometimes we can't help being afraid, and knowing that we do not have control doesn't make things any better, but God ultimately is in control. This uncertainty that we feel a lot of times can hinder us, sometimes crush our faith if we're not careful, but our faith in this type of fix is knowing that God's purpose will stand regardless of what happens. He foreordained us this crisis, our provision, and he wanted something to come out of all that, and he ordained that thing to be birthed as we walk in faith. In this sense, God predestined everything so that he can manifest his glory. When fear rises up, our love for God responds with courage. God knew about the crisis, he prepared for it. He put us in it so that we could minister his grace and point people to him. He foreordained the answers so that he could be glorified through it all. God's blessings are bigger than the brokenness that we see and feel. Now, an expanded version of this prayer is kind of neat. It could sound something like this. It could sound like the fear of the Lord is the beginning of understanding God's wisdom. Our obedience to his word brings us to understand his will so that our fear in the crisis cannot separate us from his loving care. We will praise him and his name forever and lend the love of God that we hold in our hearts to give hope to all around us. We want to thank you today for joining us on a morning prayer journey, and we ask that you join us for more Messianic topics on Facebook, Apostolic Messianic International. We thank you for coming. We'll see y'all next time. Lehithra.